You're listening to a Life in Quebec podcast. For more, visit lifeinquebec.com.
Hi, I'm Michael Bourguignon, editor of Life in Quebec, and we're here in the beautiful and historic Morin Centre with Graham Fraser, the Commissioner of Official Languages. And we're very happy to have you here. I know that you've been to this beautiful library before.
Yes.
Tell us about it.
Well, I lived here in Quebec City from 1979 until 1986, and our two sons were young. This part of the library was at that point the children's section. There were children's books all over this table, and I think our sons spent many hours here in this library, and it was only a short walk from the National Assembly, and I would quite often slip away myself just for the peace and quiet that the library had. And I wrote a book about René Lévesque and the Parti québécois in power, and had the book launch here. Part of the reason for that was so that members of the Lévesque cabinet would discover what a place this was, so that it was virtually unknown to the Quebec government at that time. And so they would discover this pearl in the heart of old Quebec.
Okay. In your last annual report, you mentioned that the Quebec government needs to do more to promote the vitality of the English-speaking community. We're here in Quebec City, where obviously Anglophones are a minority. Do you think anything has changed, or do you still feel that more needs to be done? And if so, what can be done?
Well, I think there are a number of things. I certainly don't think that there is any hostility towards the English language community. I think that there is but often people in government, particularly public servants in Quebec City, where, as you say, the English minority is small, not very visible, don't take into account the impact of their policies, their pieces of legislation, and it often requires the English minority to mobilize, to bang their fists a bit on the table and talk about the impact that certain legislative changes will have on their institutions. One of the things that I've mentioned in the past is that there is no office inside the Quebec government whose responsibility it is to take into account the needs of the English-speaking minority. I've talked to both members of the previous government and the current government about this, and there is, I think, some recognition that it would be valuable to have a point of contact for English community leaders in the government. What form that might take remains to be seen, but we've had two major pieces of legislation that have come from the Quebec government, which have had one that hasn't yet been announced on changing the structure of school boards. Mm-hmm. The other changed the nature of health administration, and it required the English community to mobilize to a substantial degree to ensure that there be some protection of the interests of the English language health institutions. In terms of, we don't yet know what the bill will be in terms of school boards, but I think the government, I hope the government will take into account that the school boards are strong traditional community organizations for the English community, and have traditionally played a much stronger role in the English-speaking community than school boards have in the French majority community. In New Carlisle, for example, over 50% of registered voters turned out to vote for the school board elections. The overall average for Francophone voters across the province was between 2 and 4%. The overall average in the English community was 17%, which is not terrific, but when you consider that in Montreal, a large number of people on the electoral lists are not parents, and so are less likely to be engaged. But in small communities, as in the Gaspé, it remains a critical community institution. So I think these are two examples of how it is important for the English-speaking communities, because they're all very different, to have some point of contact inside the bureaucracy.
Okay. How likely is that to happen?
Well, I had a meeting with the Premier, talked about it, and he said that while his initial instinct was that he didn't like the idea of dividing Quebecers and saying that there are some Quebecers who are different from others, he did recognize the value of a point of contact. Where that point of contact would be located, I'm not sure, and where this would be on the government's priorities, I'm not sure either. But I certainly didn't get the door slammed in my face when I raised the subject as a matter of conversation.
Okay, but in the absence of that sort of point of contact at this point, you mentioned the Anglophone community has had to mobilize. You mentioned banging on the tables, and I can think back to the 1995 referendum when the term "angryphone" was coined, because at that point a certain segment of the English-speaking population just decided we've had enough. We need to do something to protect our own rights. Do you think that's still the case? Does the English-speaking community need to fight for itself?
I think that there are strong community organizations who I think do a very good job of representing the community. I don't think that anger is necessarily. I think it was Bismarck who said that anger is a poor advisor. I think that what we've seen in the evolution over the years is that those people Anglophones who are living in Quebec now, with some exceptions, but by and large, it's a matter of choice that they've decided to remain here and as part of a minority. Not everybody wants to be part of a minority, and those people who don't want to be part of a minority community are very free to leave, and there have been thousands who have. Those who have decided to either stay here or come here, and there's now net stability, if you like, in terms of there are many Anglophones who move to Quebec as there are Anglophones who leave Quebec. And this is the first time, the last two censuses were the first time that was the case, really, since I think 1971 or 1966. I mean, there's been an out-migration of Anglophones for Quebec over the last 50 years. That out-migration is now balanced by in-migration, and so there's stability to the English language community. My sense is that those people who have chosen to live here appreciate the richness of life in Quebec, the value of having access to two cultures as well as just one, and it is an enriching experience to be part of this. But it's a very particular experience, and living as part of a minority is quite a different experience from being part of a majority community.
But at the same time, you have expressed concern in the past about Anglophones leaving Quebec. And in fact, as recently as your last annual report, that was mentioned. Is it still a concern, even though things seem to have stabilized? Where are we going? Do you think that it's still a problem?
I think it depends on the region, and I think that one of the things that is you have to keep in mind is that Montreal has its own dynamic as a vital urban metropolis, and there is the phenomenon that I think of as the Arcade Fire phenomenon of young, creative, artistic people being drawn to Montreal. And these are people who would not otherwise move to Mississauga or Saskatoon. If they weren't going to move to Montreal, they might move to Berlin or Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. They are drawn by the cultural vitality of one of the most culturally energetic cities in North America, and ranking with the cultural energy of cities in the world. It's quite different in in small towns, rural communities. The Anglophone population of the Gaspé has gone over the last 30 years from 25,000 to 8,000. The Anglophone, similarly, Sherbrooke used to be a predominantly English city. Now you have a quite small English minority in the eastern townships that are spread out over a geographic area the size of Belgium. So it becomes a challenge for that community to maintain the vitality of its institutions. Mm-hmm. Same thing in Quebec City. Jeffrey Hale Hospital used to be a full-service hospital that was really at the service of the English community. That role has become transformed. There's now a Anglophone clinic at Jeffrey Hale Hospital mm-hmm. that serves people in English. It becomes more of a challenge when the community is smaller. Quebec City, I think, is in a very positive place for English speakers, in part because the mayor and the Chambre de Commerce have both recognized that there is a shortage of bilingual people for commercial and business purposes. And so the mayor sponsored a forum on Anglophone migration to Quebec, in which, working with our office, there was a very useful, very vigorous discussion about what are the problems, what are the tools, what are the challenges, what are the assets and advantages that Anglophones have moving to Quebec City. And it's something that the mayor is very supportive of. The fact that the City Hall contributed enormously to the renovation of this library and this building, this center, is in itself testimony to the degree to which Quebec City Hall was prepared to put its money where its mouth was in terms of its support of the English-speaking minority community.
You provided a very vivid and I think accurate description of Montreal, using words like vitality and cultural diversity and dynamism, etc. Objectively, how would you compare that to Quebec City? Because a lot of people, when they come to Quebec, they'll choose Montreal or maybe Quebec City, one of the two. Okay? And each has its own flavor. What is the flavor of Quebec City from the perspective of an Anglophone?
Well, for one thing, it is a much smaller community. The greater Quebec City area has a population of about 800,000, and the last time I looked, there are 15,000 English speakers in this area. Although there are schools that were located on the basis of what were originally historic neighborhoods in Quebec City. Those schools have to bus people in from fairly long distances. But Quebec City is a wonderful place to live. I mean, it's as I was saying, I lived here for 7 years. Because the community is small, there is the same kind of support for the English language public schools, Holland School, St. Foy School, Quebec High School, St. Patrick's, as you would expect for a private school. People mobilized, parents mobilized. Holland School was one of the first schools to have computers because the parents mobilized to ensure that there were computers for their children. It has all of the benefits of the deeply rooted historical quality that Quebec City has, and also that quality of having the natural world, having nature so nearby, being whether it's Cap Tourmente and the geese that come seasonally in the fall and the spring, whether it's skiing at Mont Sainte Anne or at Stoneham. You have English language churches, English language organizations. The scouting movement is active. The Voice of English Speaking Quebec is an active organization. Here at Morin College, you can just see, looking around you, the degree to which this library has remained up to date in terms of it's ensuring that there's not just books which date from the 19th century, which there are, but also very contemporary book. They continue to purchase every year. Just sitting here, you see Keith Richards' Life, which was a bestseller last year. So they have ensured that anybody in the English community, and I'm sure they still do this, they also have lots of subscriptions to English language magazines, so that it can be a touchstone to the rest of the English-speaking world.
Okay, well, speaking of the rest of the English-speaking world, outside of Quebec, a lot of people don't think about this, but of course there are language minorities. I grew up in New Brunswick, which is the officially bilingual province. The Acadians, les Acadiens in New Brunswick, obviously have their own concerns. Do you think minorities outside of Quebec have the same challenges that the English minority here in Quebec has, or is it vastly different?
Each community is very different. One of the things that I've learned as commissioner is just how different those communities are across the country. Traditionally, there is a view among the Francophone communities in the rest of the country that the view that is often reflected by Quebec nationalists, that the English minority is the most privileged minority in the world. And as I was saying earlier, Montreal has its own dynamic of, you have 600,000 people in a fairly limited geographic area, and there's a substantial degree of economic, social, and cultural self-sufficiency. But if you were to compare the situation of the English community in Quebec City and the French-speaking community in Sudbury or Saint Boniface, you'd see a similar kind of richness, but also challenges. I mean, in Saint Boniface, there is the Saint Boniface Hospital serves people in both languages. There is the Université Saint Boniface, which offers post-secondary education to the Francophone communities, not only in Manitoba, but also in other Western provinces. One of the differences, I would say, is that each community has its own historic context. In British Columbia, some 90% of the Francophone population comes from somewhere else. So they're there by choice. They often hitchhiked out there to ski and met somebody and decided to stay. It's an active community. There are lots of Francophones from other parts of the world that have moved to Vancouver for either business reasons or just as immigrants. They have a community organization. There are schools. There are a variety of institutions. But because everybody comes from somewhere else, there's not a deeply rooted sense of historical grievance. Whereas I often say, a bit flippantly, in Manitoba, Louis Riel was hung last week, and in New Brunswick, the expulsion of the Acadians happened the week before last. So in both of those communities, there's a deep-rooted historical sense of their connection to that place, and of historical grievance of treatment. So that means that there is a very different historical context than there is for the English minority in Quebec. A few years ago, Statistics Canada did in addition to the statistical studies that they did a qualitative study of interviews with people in the minority communities, and what they found was that the English community in Quebec had more resources but was more pessimistic, and the English minorities outside, the French-speaking minorities outside Quebec had fewer resources but were more optimistic than and I think it's in part because the English community in Quebec is not as strong as it was 50 years ago, and you can measure the decline and influence and power and economic clout. And the English-speaking minority, the French-speaking minorities outside Quebec are better off than they were 50 years ago. They earn more money, they have better education, they have more rights, they have schools, they have institutions, and so there's a sense of we're on the upswing.
Okay. What are the reasons behind that? Behind both situations?
Well, I think that in terms of the English minority in Quebec, until the 1970s, English speakers in Quebec didn't feel they were a minority. They felt they were part of the Canadian majority. Until Suez, there was in the late 1950s, there were a sense that we were all part of the British Empire, and requires a certain amount of historical study to realize that was the way Canada was viewed until it broke with Britain over Suez in 1956. Similarly, the English minority had real economic clout, real economic superiority, power. And that power relationship has changed. One of the things that's happened over the last since 1982 for the French-speaking minorities outside Quebec is that they now have the prejudices that applied for a century have been done away with by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They have a guarantee of schools across the country. They have a guarantee of control of school boards across the country. And so that in itself has strengthened the quality of French spoken. The degree to which those schools become anchors for those communities is very impressive, and from that has grown a not only primary and secondary schools, but also post-secondary education. It's now possible to get a university degree in French in really every province except Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland. But whether it's Université Sainte-Anne, Université de Moncton, in Quebec, obviously, Université d'Ottawa, Université Laurentienne, Université de Hearst, Glendon College, Université Saint-Boniface. There is now the Cité Universitaire at the University of Regina, the Campus Saint-Jean at the University of Alberta, and Simon Fraser has a Bureau d'Affaires francophone et francophile. All of which are programs which offer a four-year university education in French across the country. And all of those things have strengthened French language communities. So you now see professional associations like the there are French language lawyers associations in most provinces now. There's now a network of healthcare organizations that offer services in French across the country. So those institutional networks have added immeasurably to the strength and vitality of those communities.
So do you think that the French-speaking minority communities outside of Quebec, obviously, are well served? Do they get the services they need, the resources they need, more so maybe than the Anglophones of Quebec?
You know, it becomes, as I say, it all depends on where you are, what the nature of service you need. I mean, you mentioned earlier in the conversation the phenomenon of the Anglophones. I don't think it was just the 95 referendum that generated that phenomenon. I think it was prior to that. And what I observed about that was that the angriest part of the English community in Quebec was that slice of the population that was over 65. Mm-hmm. And the reason was these were people who had grown up, lived their working lives when it wasn't necessary to learn French to be able to earn a living. And they had retired, and all of a sudden they needed healthcare services, they needed social services, they needed the resources of the state. And with the transformation of the state in Quebec, the creation really of the state in Quebec over the last 50 years, mm-hmm. that operates in French, it was harder and harder for them to get the services that, certainly off the island of Montreal. But even in Montreal, in some cases, there are some challenges getting those services in French, in English. That is just not as great a challenge for people who are under 45, who have grown up in an era where they knew that if they were going to stay in Quebec, they were going to be living as part of a minority community in mm-hmm. which they would have to, in which the public life of the society would be French. Each Francophone minority community and each minority community has different resources and different needs. We, a few years ago, did a series of community vitality studies of minority communities across the country, and discovered that each community had different set of needs. In some cases, it was challenges for an aging population. In other cases, it was a challenge of lack of leadership, healthcare resources. So it really varies from one community to the next. I really hesitate to generalize talking about all of the Francophone communities outside Quebec and all the English community in Quebec, because there are so many English communities that they are very different.
Okay. If you think about Quebec City specifically, part of your mandate as official languages commissioner is to receive complaints from the public about services. If you think about Quebec City, can you think of what kind of things the Anglophone community is concerned about? Is it primarily healthcare? Is it education? Is it something more specific than that?
Well, certainly in terms of complaints, I don't think we've had complaints from the English minority in Quebec City, but our complaints are limited to complaints about their ability to get services from the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
And so we get very few, if any, complaints of people who have not been able to get service in English from Air Canada or from the airport in Quebec City or from Passport Canada or from the post office. The complaints that we get from Anglophones in Quebec are often from prisoners in federal penitentiaries, where because of the increase of the number of some of the government's policies that have increased the number of people who are in Canadian prisons, they've moved prison populations around, and so you will get unilingual prisoners in Quebec prisons, unilingual English-speaking prisoners in Quebec prisons, where even though Corrections Canada is fully cognizant of their obligations, not every prison guard is bilingual or thinks about their obligation to use both languages when they announce that it's the time to go to the exercise yard or the time to go to the job training session. And so we've had complaints from English-speaking prisoners who said, I missed my job training session because I didn't understand the announcement. Mm-hmm. We've also had some complaints from Anglophone employees in some of the large postal handling centres where they feel that they have not been able to get their work materials in English or some of the training that they wanted in English. But by and large, for people living in Quebec City, I can't remember any complaints that we've had from the English-speaking community. The concerns of the community, there are concerns about employment, of whether I think most of the concerns of the English community in Quebec City are around provincial issues rather than federal issues. But there has been, nevertheless, an effective informal cooperation between the Family Support Center at the military base at Valcartier on the one hand and Emploi Québec on the other, where Emploi Québec recognized that Valcartier had a network of contacts with English-speaking employers or employers who needed English-speaking employees, and so when they would get people seeking work, would sometimes refer them to the Family Support Center in Valcartier, so that they could connect them with some of their network of employers.
Okay. That's kind of a distinct group within Quebec City, because you mentioned Valcartier.
Yeah.
A lot of people come from other provinces to come to Valcartier, either it's the husband or the wife, whichever one. There's a spouse who's in the military, and they come here without speaking any French at all.
Yeah.
What are their specific needs?
Well, one of them, which only really came to light when the Parti Québécois proposed to do away with the exemption that had been part of Bill 101 for military families, was going to close what they viewed as that loophole that would have prevented the children of military families who did not qualify for English school to enable them to attend English school. The effects of that on a number of English language schools, both in the Quebec City area and around Bagotville, would have been huge. Mm-hmm. The impact on the French-speaking majority school system would have been marginal. That legislation died with the defeat of the Parti Québécois. The Liberals have not revived that, but that was one where I think that the English community in Quebec City recognized that there were vulnerabilities that they hadn't even been aware of, hadn't occurred to anybody, that the government was going to close that loophole.
Okay. I'll ask you the question that nobody wants to ask or answer. Are language laws still necessary in Quebec at this point in our lives?
I think that there is a huge symbolic value in the only French-speaking society in North America being able to present itself as such. I think that the sign law, the signage elements of the Charte de la langue française have played an extremely important role in presenting a French face for a French-speaking society. It's not up to me to decide whether the legislation is necessary or not, but I think certainly the signage aspects have, particularly since the amendments that were required by the Supreme Court, in which other languages are now permitted, but that there be French language predominance on signs, is a literally graphic way of saying this is a predominantly French-speaking society.
At the same time, we have the occasional dust-up, like what we called Pastagate, where the Office de la langue française went after a restaurant for having the word pasta, or Italian words on a menu. So the situation is still, it's volatile to a certain extent. Once in a while, you see this sort of.
Well, I mean, it is. Since I have responsibility for investigations under the Official Languages Act, I am very hesitant to comment on how other people who receive complaints and investigate those complaints require institutions to live up to their obligations under their respective pieces of legislation. I would point out, though, that the president of the Office de la langue française was fired after that incident. It proved to be an embarrassment to the government, and I think that it is it was for me, if you like, an object lesson that zealous application of any piece of legislation can sometimes result in unfortunate consequences, and so the people who are responsible for the teams of investigators or analysts who do that need to ensure that people are treated with respect. But it's also true that legislators need to keep in mind that if there are that laws are left on the books that the government does not want to have enforced, that there are consequences of that too.
Okay. Can you expand on that a little bit?
No, I think it speaks for itself. I mean, I think that the with any regulatory mechanism, a too zealous application of legislation can result in overly bureaucratic outcomes. But that it's the responsibility of legislators to ensure that if they want particular outcomes, they should make sure that the legislation expresses that the outcome that they want to see. We've seen examples of governments who, rather than changing a piece of legislation, will send a directive, and if it ends up before the courts, the court will say, well, actually, this organization was just respecting the law as it was written. There was a huge controversy 5 years ago when the chief electoral officer was being cross-examined by angry politicians about the fact that he was allowing people to vote while wearing a veil. And he made the point that this is what's in the legislation, and if the legislators want the legislation to be changed, they should change the legislation rather than expecting him to do something other than operating within the framework of existing legislation.
Okay. That controversy is now back in the news with the current federal election campaign. Is it a tempest in a teapot? We've talked about how one woman had a very sort of public profile and all this, but that it doesn't really impact a lot of people. Is this something we still need to be talking about?
That's way beyond my mandate.
I'm just curious.
We're having this conversation before the election. There are some of the political parties who are taking a strong position on one side of that issue, others who are taking a strong position on the other side of the issue. As I'm speaking to you, I don't know who's going to form the government. As a former political reporter, I can tell you that I can't remember an election where I had so little idea of what the outcome would be 4 days before an election. But I'm accountable to all parliamentarians, and really it remains to be seen what the policy will be of the new government, because those two sides are engaged in a debate about identity, a debate about values, a debate about the nature of immigration, and these are issues that are quite appropriate for a democratic debate. And I have my own views, but I will keep them to myself.
Fair enough. In 2013, you were reappointed for another 3-year term.
Yes.
Okay. At this point, do you have any specific objectives when you look back at the end of that term? What do you want to have accomplished?
There are a number of things that I've been involved in that I am very pleased about. I was part of the group of language commissioners who came together to form the International Association of Language Commissioners. I think that one of the things that have happened over the course of it will be I will have been in power in my office for 10 years when my mandate is completed, and in December, about the time that your publication comes out, it'll be the 10th anniversary of only the Second Amendment of the Official Languages Act, which requires federal institutions to take positive measures for the growth and development of minority language communities. Mm-hmm. So I think that my office has been able to play a positive role in terms of facilitating the application of this new element of the law, both in terms of promoting a better understanding of what these obligations were to federal institutions that didn't have a very clear idea of what this meant, because positive measures are not defined in the Act. Mm-hmm. Also supporting minority language communities when they argued that this had not happened. So we've been before the courts to following the fact that the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation eliminating local programming in CBUF Windsor. Mm-hmm. We both took the CBC to court to establish whether we had jurisdiction, and also fought for restoring that programming. The CRTC basically adopted our position mm-hmm. and made that part of the condition of license for Radio-Canada. The question of our jurisdiction over CBC Radio-Canada is still before the courts. Mm-hmm. We've intervened before the courts about 20 times in one form or another. Very early in my mandate, it was our investigation and report on the investigation and our intervention before the courts which led to the creation of the Language Rights Support Program, mm-hmm. Which replaced the Court Challenges Program, which had been abolished by the government. It was abolished between the time my name was put forward and my arriving in the office. And so that was our first serious work on the new Part 7 of the Act, this new mm-hmm. obligation. We continued to work on it, both in terms of our court interventions and also in a more proactive, promotional way, in working with communities and working with federal institutions to result in a better understanding of what this new obligation meant.
Okay. Final question: How do you plan to celebrate your 10th anniversary?
Well, I still got another year to go before I do that. I have a year to plan. I'll probably take some time off, but remains to be seen. I'm having some conversations with university about the possibility of doing something afterwards, mm-hmm. but it remains to be seen what that might be. I'm not planning to run anything or administer anything. It's been hugely exciting and challenging and interesting to be at the head of an organization of 160 people. Mm-hmm. I went from being a journalist to from basically managing a keyboard for over 35 years to being the senior administrator of what seemed to me to be a huge organization. Everybody in government says, it's such a small organization compared to government departments of 15,000 people, but it sure felt pretty big to me. It's been fascinating, but I think I will have I won't be hungering for a position where I do performance appraisals and hiring and evaluation and all of that, and budgets and all of that stuff. But I'm hoping that there can be some way in which I can share some of what I've learned over the last 10 years and over what will be almost 50 years of being in the working world.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time, Mr. Fraser. I really appreciate it. My name is Michael Bourguignon with Life in Quebec, and we're here with Graham Fraser, the Official Languages Commissioner of Canada. And this is a Life in Quebec vidcast. We thank you for watching.
Thank you for listening to the Life in Quebec podcast. For more news, commentary, editorials and opinion, visit lifeinquebec.com/podcast.